Hello, welcome to our channel, where we set out to explore wonderful great works of literature.
While dressed in elegant clothing because
Why the hell not? So, this will be the last video of our spooky marathon reading marathon series.
Read-A-Thon.
And hopefully that'll be the last time we have creepy Ava voice overlapping it. But what we wanted to do was...
or maybe not.
In the culmination of this series, we wanted to review one of my personal favorite short story writers, Guy de Maupaussant. And Guy de Maupaussant... Yeah, thank you very much. I practiced my credit for this. So Guy de Maupaussant is... actually, I think probably have to read a little biographical note.
I want to just hold this one.
You want to hold the book? Okay. So Guy de Maupaussant was... Maupaussant. He was born in August 5th, 1850. In Normandy, and I guess that's all I'm going to somewhat say about him.
I don't think you need to open the book for that.
Yeah, no kidding. So there's much more to be found about Guy de Maupaussant, but one thing, a very interesting detail about his, a detail about his life, or I should say death, is that he died in a sanatorium. I think it was like Salpetre, one of those famous sanatoriums, and of course, one of the side stories I have is very interesting because it ties into the novella that we would be speaking to today, and the story is called Horla.
Oh yeah,
I love it. Very, very good delayed reaction.
Out of all the stories we read so far, the Horla is really beautiful.
The Horla was very deeply disturbing in many ways, but it's a very subtle story. It's not overt horror.
Yeah.
It definitely is on a psychological realm.
Yeah.
But did we want to talk briefly? So this is a collection of short stories written by Guy de Maupaussant. And Guy de
Maupaussant. You just start saying his name as many times as possible.
Okay. I like it how it rings on, like rolls off the tongue. So he's a rather cynical writer. Like, there's a lot of despair, a lot of sort of brutal satire about his writing, right? So it's a very dark, his character is quite dark, and he has a dark humor to in a lot of his stories. So you remember this one, we read this one together, and this is the title of the collection is based off of one of the interesting stories that we wanted to touch on before we get to La Horla, and that's The Necklace. So this gives you a flavor of what Guy de Maupaussant is like in terms of his approach to literature and approach to human nature.
Yeah, it's almost like a dark humor to it, right?
Yeah.
Like the ending is pretty humorous. Don't give this story away because in case people want to, but it's, or I don't know.
I think in this particular instance it might just give you a good illustration. So there's a kind of a lowly bureaucratic official with his very ambitious wife, and she's very vain and very conceited, and she likes to think of herself as like a very high-minded, sort of very aristocratic type of woman, right? And of course, as a lowly bureaucratic husband, you know, they don't have that much money. You know, they're probably middle class, roughly middle class. And so one day he gets a promotion at work, and he's invited to the Grand General's ball, or whatever the case might be, at the highest level in his bureaucratic office. They get invited.
Yeah.
And of course, the wife is despairing at the fact that she has nothing to wear, and everyone's going to look so beautiful and elegant, and she's going to look like a peasant, right? Yeah. And so she goes to one of her very wealthy girlfriends, and she says, "Can I please borrow your diamond necklace just for one night? I swear I'll return to you in one piece. You know, just let me do so. I just want my 15 minutes of fame." And sure enough, her friend lets it to her. They go to the ball. They have a glorious time. Everyone's enchanted with her, and she's wearing this brilliant necklace. And finally, they get into the carriage and they go home. And sure enough, she loses it. She doesn't know where it went, and they're both mortified. And because it was such an expensive piece, neither of them can afford to just replace it, go to a jewelry store and replace it for their friend. So both of them work for 10 years, and she's like scrubbing floors, and she gets like all of these different like lowly jobs where she has to like really work through like the sweat of her brow, and he takes on extra hassle, and he loses 10 years of his life just like doing all these different stressful projects and whatnot. Anyway, they finally get the money, to buy it from a jeweler, the exact same replica piece to give to the girlfriend. And then finally they say, here, I'm so sorry, I forgot to tell you, like, I lost this diamond necklace, and we finally paid it back. And the girlfriend goes, what are you talking about? That was a costume jewelry. That was a piece of costume jewelry not worth 5 francs. Like, don't worry about it. And she like goes in a swoon, or she like completely falls into tears, breaks out into tears. And so that's kind of the irony, like, you know, this, you know, you're kind of like, you have almost this 15-minute of extravagance, and then you pay dearly for it for 10 years afterwards, right? All for nothing, really. So anyway, so that's kind of the flavor of his humor.
Yeah.
Now, La Horla is a very interesting story, and sometimes it comes across a little bit obscure in people who like the horror and literature genre. Maybe people who are aficionados in it, experts in it, that definitely know the story. But I was first brought to the attention of this particular story from a professor of mine. Actually, he was an adjunct professor, and he was an older gentleman named Dr. Al Shane. And he was a bit of an Indiana Jones style character. He actually went to Bolivia during the Civil War, and he was really interested in the Mayan culture and Mayan technologies in the ancient world. But also, he was a professor of sleep. Sleep research, right? And one day I went onto his website, and he had written an article about how he believed this particular story, La Horla, may be related to a particular sleep disturbance, or sleep apnea of some sort, or some sort of sleep paralysis that the actual author, Guy de Maupaussant, was actually experiencing, and that may have even contributed to his own suicide in the hospital. So there is an interesting theory that that this story, which I will get into in a moment, has a biographical character to it, an autobiographical character to it, right? Which makes it a tinge more creepy. So essentially, it's written in a diary form.
Yeah.
So they're just diary entries, and you slowly see the progression of the main character into a descent into insanity.
Yeah.
And so he's being haunted by this invisible creature. And
Drinking his milk.
it's drinking his milk, it's drinking his water, and he does these weird experiments where he just kind of like, he's trying to figure out what is happening.
Well, he thinks it's himself. He's like,
Yeah.
I guess I drank, and I was, you know, but then there's just all these weird things that are happening that he knows it couldn't possibly be him.
Exactly.
So there's another, and then he starts to feel the presence.
And
When the presence starts to go inside of him.
Yeah.
Ooh, it's spooky.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one day he goes to a priest as well, and he wants to talk about it with the priest. And it was very interesting what the priest said. He was like, talking about the sort of the realm of the invisible,
Yeah.
right? And he says, like, when the wind blows, you see it has such it can have such powerful devastating effects. It can topple houses, it can break down trees, you can see even just the rustling of the leaves and the wind. But yet you can never see the wind. You always see what effect the wind has on things. But just because you cannot see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And so that he starts to come to this realization that there are things that are 5 senses that, you know, bats, dogs, all these different creatures, many different creatures in this world are endowed with particular sensitivities and an ability to perceive things that our senses aren't able to perceive. And so that doesn't negate, just because we cannot see it with our own 2 eyes does not mean that it's not there.
Yeah.
And that sort of reflection and meditation was actually also very interesting, because if you take it for what it is, if you strip all of your prejudices and your preconceived ideas about reality and how reality works, as if we know how it works, the world becomes more inhabited by strange creatures and entities that, you know, we never give a second glance to because we assume we're beyond it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the most powerful scene is when he's like physically trying to escape,
Yeah.
and then he's in this carriage, and it almost reminds me of when you hear people have like tics, or like they're like, what, I don't know what came over me, like something completely comes over their own personality, and he screams home to the carriage driver.
Yeah.
And that just like, ooh, it just creeped me out, and he couldn't even control his own voice at that point. That was like the spookiest scene for me.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I knew.
Because that was the brink of his like. That's when he realized this was it. You know, he had no control anymore.
And there are certain moments of pathos where you're just like, he feels he's finally relieved himself of this creature, only to be completely, struck down by those notions of freedom. And sort of the conclusion of the story is very eerie.
Yeah.
I'm not going to give it away, but, just think this gentleman, his last days were spent
that's
in
the
an asylum.
I think that's the creepiest part about it, is he obviously knew what it felt like to not have control over your own mind and body, right?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, very, very eerie. On a side note, August Strindberg, who was, I believe, a Norwegian playwright, he wrote very strange autobiographical tales, like the Diary of an Occultist or something like the Occult Diaries, and he also, I think, went mad. But he taught, and like paranoid, schizophrenic, you would imagine, right? But then what he's talking about has a very spooky level. So if you're really into the deeply psychological, scary stuff, absolutely recommend this story.
Okay, next.
Which leads us to something different. So this is called The Terror That Comes in the Night. And of course, it isn't a piece of fiction, as you can see here. What does it say as a subtitle?
Where? In the back?
Yeah, what's it say? An experience-centered...
Where? Oh, an experience-centered study of supernatural occult traditions.
So this is by a scholar named David J. Is it Hufford?
Hufford, yeah.
Hufford. So so he was a professor of folktales and folklore. And so he was kind of like, what would you call that person? Would they be like an anthropologist? I think something along those lines. Like a social anthropology. I think something along those lines. That general discipline has a lot of different branches. So he studies different folk traditions. And he actually was at the University of Nova Scotia, I believe, or New Brunswick. One of the universities on the East Coast.
Okay.
And in 1971, he started an investigation using as much empirical methodologies as possible to make it as scientific, if you will, as possible. And of course, as we all know, science doesn't take shouldn't take a prejudice in terms of its interpretation of reality, but it's a particular method of inquiry. And so what he does is he actually lays out a particular methodology that he used to investigate the phenomenon of the Old Hag assault tradition, right?
Yeah.
And of course,
Memorial University in Newfoundland.
Memorial.
Yeah, that's Newfoundland.
Yeah, Newfoundland. Yeah, okay. Memorial University. So he develops a questionnaire and he interviews people who experienced the Old Hag tradition, Old Hag attacks. And in ancient lore, these were actually what they would term incubi, incubus or a succubus. And an incubus is a male form of like a demonic creature that lays on top of your chest while you sleep and gives you an overwhelming sense of pressure on your chest.
But levitation at the same time.
So there are variations of it, right? Yeah, there are variations. Some people just feel complete depression, some other people feel a levitation and simultaneously a compression on their chest. And so the female version is the succubus for a male, and for female they have different sort of demonic contrasexual sort of demonic possessions, right? But there's all these variations, and one of them is this idea of sleep paralysis.
Yeah.
Where, do you want to describe, because you're also very familiar with that sort of...
Yeah, I've had it before.
So have I. And I'm sure many of you out there as well. Mm-hmm. So you're like laying down, and you're neither asleep nor fully awake.
You're in the in-between state of deep sleep and wakefulness.
And so a lot of these anecdotes, people say, no, I was fully awake when this was happening. So you feel you're completely paralyzed. Your entire body's paralyzed. You're laying down in bed, for example. And all of a sudden, someone, they always describe it as someone, enters your room and hovers over you or close to your bedside or close to your face. And there's like this dark, and a lot of people describe like almost like evil, malicious eyes, right? Yeah, and some people describe like a shadowy figure.
They may not even ever see their features, but they know that it's
that it means
evil
harm,
intention,
and it means harm, right? And so people are, of course, incredibly terrified in these moments, but they can't move a muscle. So they can't fight it off or do anything. And the whole story is him collecting all of these anecdotes from a wide variety of people, from all these different demographics, who experience this in one form or another. Some people believe that it was like almost like the Old Hag is like sort of the idea, like it's almost like this old witch who sits on your chest. But there are different instances where sometimes it's almost like a rapist type predator that women feel this almost sense of like
literally assaulting them.
Yeah, like this invasion of something very malicious and malign.
Weirdly enough, one of the creepiest things is that each of the stories have some element of similarity between the Hag, right?
Yeah.
Like there's these characteristics that are very common amongst all of them. Like, and one of them really grosses me out and creeps me out is the sound of someone shuffling their feet.
Yeah.
But they're wet. Like it's a
swooshing,
wet,
like a
wet
swooshing.
slipper.
Yeah.
Swooshing on a rug or a floor.
Yeah.
With socks on, like a soft bottom footwear, but it's wet.
Yeah.
Oh, that something about that sound just gives me chills.
Yeah.
Oy.
Oh yeah, exactly. And it's very peculiar because there are a lot of characteristics that he identifies that have all these different commonalities, right? That indicate when it's this type of assault attack.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the one that always in my mind I always imagined was the one where this 19-year-old girl is in a hospital. She had recovered from like an injury to her leg, and she's of course like her legs elevated and she's kind of immobile in her bed, obviously and one of the things is they're always on their back.
Yeah, which is so interesting because every time I've had a night terror, there's been two things that have been in common. I'm warm, so I'm really hot in the room.
Yeah.
The temperature's higher, and I'm on my back.
Yeah.
And every time I've talked to other people who've had night terrors, it's the same thing. They're on their back.
Yeah.
And then in this book, there's all these accounts of people only ever happens on my back.
Or and when they're super tired as well. Like let's say they've been like exhausted in one way or another. But so this girl's in the bed in the hospital, and of course the hospital room is L-shaped, so she can't see the door that leads into the hallway. So there's a wall that she's facing, almost like a partition. But then she hears that shuffling come across. She said, as if two nurses were coming in with stocking feet and no shoes on in the carpet. So there's a sense in which they're kind of like shuffling into the room. And of course, no one is there. But then she sees a hovering, disembodied head with very malicious eyes right in the corner of the room, staring at her very angrily. And then it comes like very much close to her face, and she's trying to press the panic button.
Yeah.
And like, but there was this one moment where she felt herself actually levitated
and pushed down
and compressed. Yeah.
And she's like, what I find so interesting is that they know logically it doesn't make sense. They're like, I know that that's not possible, but that's the only way I can describe how I felt.
Exactly.
Which is like almost like they're trying to justify,
and a lot of them
rationalize it.
Yeah.
I just think it's really cute because I was clearly scared and Rupert came.
Oh yeah.
Just like remembering it gave me goosebumps, and then they came over to comfort me.
So she felt levitated, and just as the nurse were coming actually in for them to respond to the call, she dropped into the bed, and she reported actually feeling some spinal injury for a few days after that because she was dropped into the bed quite abruptly. So it's bizarre. It's a very unusual phenomenon, but in a sense, it's also quite common because I think a lot of us have this sense of a presence or that sense of sleep paralysis or night terror, right?
Terrifying.
And we could always explain it away. We could always give a sort of a physiological or psychological explanation, but that doesn't really explain it away in the sense of give you a final cause or reason for why these things happen.
Yeah.
And it's very bizarre. So La Horla, my old professor would imagine, was almost like a literary expression of this phenomenon that we're experiencing.
Yeah.
So very creepy stuff, and that's why we wanted it to be the final video in the series. So how would you rate La Horla?
Oh. 5 out of 5 as far as creepy goes? Oh yeah.
Yeah, 5 out of 5.
5 out of 5.
It's
And
really
this? like 10 out of 5.
Yeah, this is
Because
like
it's
if you're
it's
interested
like
in
when
it.
you're trying to prove something from a scientific model, like most things you read are so scientific that it's like, okay, this isn't spooky. But the weird thing is that the more scientific it was, the spookier it was.
Yeah.
Because it was so, each story had their similarities, and that just
And
creeps me out.
and
Why
it's-
are they all similar?
And it's like a lot of it's transcriptions, right?
Yeah.
So it's actual like
transcriptions. Yeah.
you actually can tell
Imagine
when
the person. And,
and when they're pausing and when they're trying to. A lot of them always say like you're gonna think I'm crazy, you know, or like a lot of them try to second guess what they experience and rationalize it away.
Yeah.
Very cool stuff.
Yeah. Anyway.
Okay. Well, anyway, we hope that will
Happy
give you a little bit of a chill.
Halloween.
Happy Halloween. We hope you all the best. Hope you have
Sleep
all
well after that.
Sleep well. And
Don't have night terrors.
Don't let those entities disturb your sleep. All right. Have a good night.